Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud While Stoned. In this video, we're going to start a new Little Blue Book. Little Blue Book number 1215, titled Robert Ingersoll, or Robert G Ingersoll, the Benevolent Agnostic, written by Joseph McCabe, one of my personal favorite writers of Little Blue Books. And this one is copyright 1927. And our contents, our chapters, is Chapter 1 is Early Growth. Chapter 2, The Infidel Makes Good. Chapter 3, Ingersoll as an Orator. Chapter 4, The Mistakes of Moses. And Chapter 5, Ingersoll's Personality. Ingersoll was one of the great orators and writers of the age of free thought, which spanned from the 1700s to, 1700s up until the early part of the 20th century. Okay, so here we go. Robert G. Ingersoll, Benevolent Agnostic, Chapter 1, Early Growth. In his God the Invisible King, Mr. H.G. Wells has a section on the religion of atheists. This modern fashion, now remember this was written in 1927, so this modern fashion of giving the name religion to a man's idealism is tantalizing. For decades we have heard that idealism would perish with religion, in the old sense of the word. And now that we find ourselves with more idealism and less religion than ever, we are smilingly assured that idealism is precisely the religion. You poor guys, I'm glad you're dead. You would hate what it was now. What it is now. Okay. I am old-fashioned and conservative, and I assured Wells that I have no religion, or even, to use his words, religiosity. But he genially disregarded me. I figure in the book as a type of the benevolent unbeliever, in the too flattering company of Professor Metchnikoff, one of the most brilliant of modern physiologists, Dr. Chalmers Mitchell, one of the most distinguished British zoologists, Sir Gilbert Murray, one of the ablest of living Hellenists, and Sir Harry Johnston, most learned of travelers and most humane of anthropologists. How Wells, one of the keenest-eyed of men, missed Robert G. Ingersoll and chose me when he wanted to examine a benevolent unbeliever, I could not understand. Amongst the great rationalists who have proved that the cultivation of high standards of personal and collective conduct does not in the least depend upon religion, Ingersoll has a unique position. He excels particularly in those graces and delicacies of individual character, in that richness and tenderness of sentiment, which are most loudly proclaimed to be inseparable from religion. With that general zeal for human welfare and advancement which has distinguished nearly every prominent rationalist for the last century and a half, he unites a geniality of disposition, an overflowing generosity, a standard of taste and conduct that would be called ascetic if it were not for the joy of living that glows in his entire being. A rare blend of happiness and temperamentness. An intense lover of Burns, the writer, not the actual, like burn yourself. My brain always has to explain that. He himself never tasted alcohol. Lucky him. Eager to use every weapon to undeceive his fellows about the Bible and the work of Christianity, he nevertheless could not bring himself to quote the cruder passages of the Old Testament, or to dwell upon the sexual license of the ages of faith. Thoroughly human in his appreciation of the pleasures which came of the high position and wealth to which his great gifts entitled him, he yet resolutely refused to make more money by sealing his lips on the subject of religion. Capable as few men were of swaying masses of people with his wonderful oratory, he took such care as orators rarely take, that the seed which he implanted in the minds of men was the seed of truth, justice, and peace. And I kind of thought, did we lose the idea of great orators and their speeches? But we really haven't. I guess we could call it TED Talks now, something like that. I think there are still great speakers and orators of different subjects that still travel around. I just don't think they're as popular as they were back then. Of course, we have TV and YouTube now. All right, I digress. But let me preface my little study of Ingersoll with a few questions to the religious reader who, more familiar with pulpit rhetoric about the fruits of infidelity, may approach such a study with some reluctance. And remember, these questions are 1927 questions, so they probably do not relate to anything today. Okay, here we go. Here's the questions for the religious reader. Let's say religious listener. Do you believe in prohibition? Or in the ideal of human welfare, which inspires the genuine prohibitionist? Do you believe that it was an obvious human duty to abolish the last traces of slavery and serfdom? Do you believe that a nation acts with elementary humanity when it seeks to alleviate poverty and protect the weak? Do you believe that the nations follow an instinct of civilization in proposing to erect tribunals of arbitration instead of the barbaric arbitrament of war? Do you believe that the duel was a relic of barbarism? The duel, like drawing pistols at 20 paces. Do you believe that it is just that the citizens of a state who bleed in its wars and suffer in its misfortunes should choose the men who are to control its life? Here's one. Do you believe that women citizens should share this right? 1927, women didn't actually have the rights. Do you believe that it is a wise and beneficent thing to educate all citizens? Do you believe that even animals ought to be protected from cruelty? Do you believe that religious tolerance is an elementary recognition of human rights? Now here's one, 1927. Do you believe that the lower races should be protected from cruelty, theft, and exploitation? 1927. I might extend the list over several pages, but I ask only one more question. How is it that these moral advances began only when skepticism began in the 18th century, and culminated with skepticism when skepticism spread to the majority of the civilized race at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century? So there you go. There's about the period of the great age of free thought an awakening. These are broad historical truths. We may quarrel, we ought not, since statistics are available as to whether vice and violence are increasing. But we cannot quarrel about these things. Men, then women, were enfranchised, and the last remnants of slavery in America and serfdom in Russia were abolished at well-known dates within the last century. Education was provided. Laws to prevent cruelty to wives, children, or animals were passed. Social and industrial legislation appeared. Schemes of arbitration were framed at definite dates in modern times. In other words, on the moral test, which it is easiest and safest to use, the test of collective conduct, the idealism of the modern race has grown with its infidelity. What the true relation of idealism to materialism is, we shall see in Little Blue Book number 1229, The Triumph of Materialism. But these little biographies exhibit it, perhaps, more convincingly than do arguments. In Paine, we saw how that's Thomas Paine, we saw how a fine inspiration of service coincided with a rejection of Christian beliefs, though belief in God and immorality remained. In Ingersoll, whom we take as a type of the next and deeper phase of American skepticism, we shall see how, when the last religious beliefs were abandoned, the finer qualities of mind and character seemed to develop more rapidly than ever. A recent and important biographer of Lincoln, Mr. N.W. Stephenson, speaks of the wave of ultra-rationalism that went over America in the 40s, that'd be 1840s. I do not know whether he was more intellectual admiration for the wave of spiritualism that succeeded it in the 1850s, but it would be a public service if the sociological section of one of the universities were to make an inquiry into this ultra-rationalism and its effects. For beyond all question, there was a great growth of idealism in America in the 1840s. The ideal of temperance spread rapidly. The resentment of slavery advanced quickly to the stage of becoming a continental force. All the philanthropic isms of later America began to germinate. In the early years of Ingersoll, which fell in that period, illustrate the germination. Robert Green Ingersoll was born on August 11th, 1833, in the large village of Dresden on the shore of Seneca Lake, New York State. He came of a sober stock, but I am, as I explained, not much interested in a man's ancestors. His mother died 3 years after his birth, so he never knew her influence. That's a shame. His father was a congregationalist clergyman, so he's a preacher. His father was a congregationalist clergyman. I'll have to look up what congregationalist is. I forgot to do that. Though he was at the time in charge of a Presbyterian church, as he often was. The Presbyterians were short of ministers, and the Congregationalists of churches, and they were near enough to each other to exchange. The Reverend John Ingersoll was the chief teacher and trainer of Robert until he reached, until he reached adolescence. And possibly the Christian who learns for the first time what a real fine man the infidel was will want the credit given to his clerical parent. To some extent, let us give it. He certainly taught the boy honesty, truthfulness, and temperamentness. The Reverend John was a very sincere Christian. On revised or Protestant lines, he ventured to differ from Christ by marrying and begetting children, but otherwise, he was very earnest. Ingersoll is in his references to his father a little distracted between loyalty to a good parent and dislike of his creed. The Reverend John was, strictly, just more than strictly temperate, and he had a great love of his children, but it creeps out. The creed cast a shadow over the home. Each biographers who seem to know more about it than they tell remark that Ingersoll rarely spoke about his boyhood, and that this was because he could say little good of it. The facts are not obscure. It was as happy a Christian home as a somber creed, an early loss of the mother, and straitened circumstances permitted. The father changed his clerical station about once a year, and the only clue to the wondering is that he was an ardent abolitionist and prohibitionist of tobacco and nice things to eat as well as drink. Green was included in the boy's name because it was the name of an early abolitionist. Abolition and prohibition were the fundamental tones of the boy's daily lessons. Even the diet was austere. What could a poor man do anyway on $200 a year? $200 a year. That's not even $1 a day. That's crazy. This is stated to have been the salary of one of Reverend John's numerous settlements. And 5 children? Wow. Generally, however, his charges were in rural districts, and living was cheap in those days. I would say on $200 a year. The most interesting point is that the boy Robert had not at all the temperament of the elect, yet he was never tempted to react on the early severity by breaking loose as parsons' sons so commonly do. Well, it's good to hear that preachers' kids have traditionally been rebellious. I knew a few. They were mostly all rebellious. Okay. Pardon me. We perceive in the formation of his character quite the opposite of a Christian influence. It is absurd and historically false to say that a boy who had been trained to certain habits by the rod and the fear of hell will automatically continue in those habits when the rod and the fear of hell gather dust in the old nursery. With adolescence comes the note of interrogation. The palate for the forbidden fruit develops. Kentucky rye and bourbon smelt good in the old days, and the prohibition extended to a great variety of tempting things. Good cigars, women, dancing, lying, cheating, swearing, reading Voltaire or Paine, and so on. The young rationalist had to examine each of these things for himself. He decided that whiskey was bad, a cigar was good, and an occasional damn immaterial. That the paternal standard was good on its Puritan side and bad on its ascetic side. That lying and cheating were wrong, but reading both sides of a question was supremely right. This creed of Ingersoll's adolescence and manhood was his own, not his father's. He was grand enough, says Ingersoll, to say to me that I had the same right to my opinions that he had to his. At what age the father reached this Christian grandeur, he does not say. In boyhood, Bob got the cane when, In Sunday school, he paralyzed the lady teacher with awkward questions about certain peculiar features of the Old Testament. He was not the kind of boy to be intimidated by canes. A healthy, restless, rather mischievous and adventurous boy, but so straight in it all. Okay, that's a strange sentence. Let's go over. And I've read through this once or twice already. He was not the kind of boy to be intimidated by canes. A healthy, restless, rather mischievous and adventurous boy, but so straight in it all that his nickname was Honest Bob. Okay. That was just strange for my brain. He had little formal education and was chiefly taught by his father, who passed in his very small world as being rather learned. The son later educated the father. He ceased to believe in hell, and he, after 50 years brooding over it, such is the religious instinct, perceived that much of the Old Testament was too human and Hebraic was too human and Hebraic to be inspired. The last glimpses we have of him is Robert Ingersoll reading to him on his deathbed Plato on immortality. Wow. I have necessarily presented the father as rather dour, but let us put in a human trait. In early on regenerate life, the Reverend John had been a great wrestler, and in 1842, in the midst of his pious career, he one day doffed his black clothes and brought down some local champion. I was, he apologized to his flock, tempted to wrestle with this man, which was not becoming of a minister. But I threw him in less than a minute. The flock was satisfied. Wrestling, terrible things to do. At the age of 18, we find Robert an independent personality. He liked a good cigar and good company. Industry had not hitherto been his primary virtue, but he was a clever reciter with a strong liking for Burns and Byron, and a good conversationalist. He was conscious that he had sentiment and some power of poetic expression, and he wrote verse. But the business of life now lay before him. I take it that he had not been a model of industry as a schoolboy, the biographers say, mainly because he instinctively felt that more than half the stuff which children are ordered to learn is useless. At 18, in 1851, he had to confront his future, and he began the preliminary studies for a lawyer's career and worked hard. Oh, we're going to pause right there because cottonmouth is creeping in. That feels much better. Okay, here we go. The biographers are not as clear as one could wish about these early years. This is due, no doubt, to Ingersoll's own healthy impatience of giving biographical details. But a really good study of Ingersoll is still to be written. E.G. Smith's Life and Reminiscence, written in 1904, and the other early biographers are too slight a material and too heavily eulogistic to carry any conviction to the critical reader. Kitteridge's Ingersoll, written in 1911, is much better, but it is too largely a manual of the author's opinions. It gushes too much, and it has the common biographical fault of taking great pains to settle dates and places and similar small details, and less trouble to explain the evolution of a fine personality. The latest small biography, C.T. Gorham's G Ingersoll, written in 1921, is little more than a string of passages from Ingersoll's lectures, with naive criticisms of them by the compiler. The book is published by the British Rationalist Press Association and written by the secretary of the association. Yet the opening sentences of it would have made Ingersoll frown. And here's the opening sentence. In the childhood of the human race, religion is a good and necessary thing. It may be that adult humanity will find it equally good and equally indispensable. God, Ingersoll would have rolled in his grave. There was once a prophet named Balaam who had an ass. Mainly using Kitteridge's record of facts, I try here to disentangle and expound the significance of Ingersoll as the highest American representative of rationalist principles in the second half of the 19th century. We need not linger long over the first 20 years. The ancestry explains nothing. For the study of it issues in what we should least expect, a character of the most buoyant, expansive, rebellious, sun-loving type. The early education, again, explains little, because the good ideals implanted by it were put on false foundations and were mingled with false ideals. Just at the time when Ingersoll begins to make himself in adolescence, we are told little that is really vital about him. It is clear enough that he began early to see that he could not accept it as a serious rule of conduct, that God wished a thing or Jesus set a good example. The first chapter in legal education would tell Ingersoll that the person on trial is not a good witness. God and Jesus, he found, were very decidedly on trial. But all rationalists will know how the young man shaped his human creed. Any man can dislike alcohol, for instance, and regard it as a cause of much misery, without asking what Jehovah thinks about the matter, or speculating why Jesus never mentions wine except in friendly or appreciative terms. I happen to agree with Jesus, but I quite understand Ingersoll. A youth can choose, for his life's sake, that he will be sober, just, truthful, and honorable. It has nothing to do with religion. In fact, one of the latest improvements on Jesus in New York is a new preacher, very prosperous by all accounts, whose gospel is not the Christian life saves in the next world, but that it pays in this. Boy, things haven't changed. The simple fact about Ingersoll is that he made the discovery 70 years ago. But he made the additional discovery that this was not Christianity. Generosity of temperament, one of the other hand, let's do that again. Generosity of temperament, on the other hand, is inborn. Neither Christian nor any other principles can manufacture it. Ingersoll had it in an exceptional degree. To help to cover his cost of education, he, in 1852, opened a private school, and when he found at the end of the first term that half the pupils had not paid and professed that they could not pay, he receipted their bills. But an incident which partly reveals his impulsiveness and partly shows his new human creed of life soon, happily for history, put him out of the teaching world. The school was at Metropolis in Illinois, to which state his itinerant father had moved, and Robert lived in a boarding house. Some religious celebration brought a bunch of parsons to the house, and they one night discussed baptism. Did the teacher believe in the Turning the page. Okay. Did the teacher believe in the efficacy of the baptismal water? They asked young Ingersoll. Yes, said Robert. With soap. So infidelity bore its usual fruits, which are Christian malice and malignity and ruin. Robert had to close the school and go live with his family at Marion, working in the county offices while he studied law. On December 20th, 1854, he was admitted to the bar. And where are we? Oh, we're at 30 minutes. Perfect timing. Okay, that also ends chapter 1 of Little Blue Book number 1215. Robert G. Ingersoll, Benevolent Agnostic. Written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1927. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.